In the middle of a warm, light April day, London Heathrow breathed amazing tranquility. Everything seemed to be moving in a steady, long-practiced rhythm. Ground vehicles rustled along the apron, crews completed pre-flight checks one by one, and a transparent light fog hung over the lanes, obscuring the sun's glare. It was an ordinary Monday, one of those days when big airports seem like miniature cities with their usual routine. And among the dozens of planes preparing for flights, a blue and white airliner with the elegant inscription BOAC on board stood out. Boeing 707, registration GRWE. He had a long journey ahead of him, starting with a short flight to Zurich, the first stop on the road towards Tel Aviv, Tehran, Bombay, Singapore, and, finally, Sydney. The flight of almost 2,000 miles, divided into many short segments, is a symbol of the time when the world was just learning to get closer. The Boeing 707 was then the pinnacle of aircraft construction, not just an airplane, but a real sign of a new era. A few decades ago, traveling from London to Australia took 4 days on a piston constellation and required 15 landings. Now, jet aircraft offered a chance to cover the same distance twice as fast, leaving oceans and the most difficult weather zones under them. But all this development had not yet made the technology perfect. At the end of the 60s, jetliners were still sensitive to vibrations, cracks, metal work, something that engineers of that time could not always foresee. Progress was admired, but it was treated with caution. The GRWE was 6 years old, a bit by modern standards, but quite in years by the standards of the first generations of jetliners. He had 1,000 hours in the air, thousands of takeoffs and landings, and had already experienced one serious incident a year earlier, an engine fire in Hawaii. Then everything went almost well. The fire was quickly extinguished, the engine was replaced, and the plane seemed to come back to life. But the memory of such events rarely disappears completely. The pilots knew that everything that burned once, failed once, could surprise them again. Although nothing seemed alarming that day, the crew that boarded Flight 712 was experienced and time-tested. The 47-year-old captain was at the helm, calm, confident, one of those pilots whose voice is difficult to imagine agitated. Almost 15,000 flight hours, dozens of routes, years of work in the line. The only detail that stands out from the overall picture is the relatively small number of watches on the Boeing 707. He knew the car, he knew its reaction, but still it couldn't be said that the type had become a second skin for him. It was a time when pilots often switched between models, when the fleet was being updated, and standardization was still in its infancy. To his right was a young but confident co-pilot who was supposed to monitor the instruments, conduct radio exchange, and help with navigation. Behind him is the pilot's check, who came on board to evaluate the captain's work. Such checks were not stressful, rather a normal part of flight life, but any check still adds a slight internal tension, barely noticeable but always present in the air. The silence in the cabin was sometimes broken only by the rustle of papers and light roll calls, short commands honed to automatism. There was confidence in this restrained, calm work, the feeling that everything was going as it should. The flight engineer, the third person in the first line, closely monitored the panels of the systems. Fuel, electrics, hydraulics. It was impossible to relax here. In the era before automatic monitoring, it was he who became the eyes and ears not only for the pilots but also for the machine itself. He was responsible for dozens of parameters, pressure, temperature, and the work balance of all 4 conways. His fingers moved quickly, confidently, over the buttons and switches, like the keys of an instrument he played every day. In the passenger cabin, life went on as usual. This list already includes families with children, business travelers, people flying to Switzerland on business or just visiting. Many went further, to Asia, the Middle East, almost to the other side of the planet. The time was different. Traveling seemed not just a change of cities, but real small expeditions. People were also surprised by the very fact that it was possible to be in a couple of days where it was previously possible to be only in a few days. Among the 6 flight attendants was a 22-year-old girl, Barbara Jane Harrison. Calm, gentle, with a warm smile, she treated the passengers as if she had known them for a long time. A year of working for the company, hundreds of flights, and not the slightest sign of fatigue. She knew how to create an atmosphere of care, which is always lacking on long-haul flights. In those days, no one could have known that this particular girl would become a heroine, whose name decades later would be pronounced by people who had never seen her. The plane was slowly rolling down the taxiway towards runway 28L. The Conway engines rumbled steadily below. The vibrations were barely noticeable. The captain carefully looked at the sensors. The oil pressure was steady, the temperature was stable, and there were no deviations in speed. Everything is just perfect. The airliner moved confidently, as if it felt like there was another long way ahead. A routine job, a familiar cycle. Takeoff, climb, stable cruiser, landing. The tower gave permission. Taxi to the lane and wait. The plane stopped. At that moment, the cabin sank into its usual pre-flight concentration. The pilots went through the last points of the checklist, and the engineers finished sorting through the systems. Then the command to take off sounded, the very point where there is no going back. The 4 thrust levers gently moved forward. The engines began to unwind, accelerating the liner along the concrete strip. The noise became denser, the hull began to shake, and the speed increased. After a few seconds, the first officer gave a short command, V1. One more moment, rotate. The plane obediently lifted its nose. The 707th easily lifted off the runway, taking the wheels off the ground, and then gained the first 10 meters of height. The buildings of Heathrow were slowly disappearing below. The London light cast a golden glow on the wing. The passengers in the cabin were smiling, and the children were looking out the windows with delight, catching the first views outside the airport. But in that calm moment, when it seemed that everything was going as it should, something began to happen inside the second engine, deep in the mechanical heart of the car, that no one had seen yet. A crack was growing in the metal, which had been withstanding enormous loads for many years, in the disc of the 5th stage of the compressor. A small, invisible, but beyond the control of the human eye. It developed millimeter by millimeter as the plane gained hundreds of meters of altitude above British soil. And in a few seconds, the silence of this clear day will be pierced by a sound that will change everything. At an altitude of about 1,500 feet, when the liner was already confidently going up, when the landing gear began to hide in niches, and the captain ordered to proceed to post-takeoff procedures, something happened that no one could have predicted. It all started with one sharp pop. It was short and powerful, as if someone had hit a metal body with a giant hammer. At the same moment, the plane jerked slightly to the left, and glasses rang in the cabin and shelves shook. Many passengers were startled by the surprise. The children stopped laughing, and someone involuntarily tightened their grip on the armrests. The pop was the result of that invisible crack finally reaching its limit inside the second engine. She's been growing for years. Without giving herself away, she lived inside the metal, experiencing thousands of cycles of heating, cooling, and vibrations. And now, on this perfect clear day, she decided to reveal herself completely. The disc of the 5th compressor stage shattered into many fragments. Each such fragment had previously been rotating at a terrific speed, thousands of revolutions per minute. And now these pieces of metal, bursting out of their place like projectiles, pierced through everything in their path. The engine casing, designed in those years to contain smaller-scale breakdowns, could not stand it. Fragments pierced the walls, cut the oil and fuel lines, destroyed the skin elements. Hot oil instantly soaked the inside of the engine, and the ruptured fuel lines began to shoot jets of kerosene, which got to where it shouldn't be, in the area of the hot parts of the engine. The flame flared up literally instantly, first inside, then, having made its way out, it licked the metal pylon and began to spread rapidly over the lower surface of the wing. The fire stretched like a long torch, as if someone had set fire to the tail of a comet. From the left row, passengers saw a bright, lively fire outside the window, unreal, frightening, too close. In the cockpit, the instrument arrows on the second engine were rapidly falling. The revolutions disappeared, the temperature jumped, and the thrust vectors became zero. The plane was noticeably driven towards the damaged engine. The captain barely managed to compensate for the deviation, pressing his right foot to the pedal and leveling the course. "Engine failure," he said abruptly, not raising his voice, but rushing what was happening. He instinctively removed the thrust lever of the second engine, with the same movement giving the command to perform the failure procedure. Everything happened with the speed with which the brain of a professional makes critical decisions, quickly with a minimum number of words. But the retracted thrust caused another undesirable effect. A continuous alarm signal lit up and began to sound that the landing gear was retracted with insufficient thrust. It was an ordinary beep, unrelated to a fire, but very similar in its persistence. The clanging in the cockpit, the squeaking, the flickering of the warning lights. All this creates instant pressure on each crew member. The captain instinctively reached out to turn off the warning, but both the first officer and the pilot stretched out their hands nearby. In this intersection of movements, the first critical mistake occurred. One of them accidentally pressed the wrong button. Instead of turning off the landing gear signal, the audible fire alarm was extinguished. It just didn't come out. The instrument lamp fire continued to burn, but the main sound indicator, the one that should instantly attract the attention of the crew, was turned off. This created a moment of confusion, the very second that can be incredibly expensive in aviation. At that moment, the flight engineer was focused on completing the rejected checklist. Everything looked pretty logical to him. The engine had crashed, the thrust was zero, the parameters had disappeared, he couldn't hear the fire, and the lamp. The lamp could light up from fluctuations. This had already happened in the 707s of that era. The program of actions, memorized to the point of automatism, dictated one thing: perform the procedure from memory, then open the card with the checklist and go through the points. He saw a fire handle in his field of vision, instinctively reached for it, but stopped. He didn't hear the fire alarm. So, according to the rules, it's not technically a fire yet. It is possible to simply destroy the engine without catching fire. And at that moment, hesitating only for a moment, he forms a false feeling, as if he had already completed the step, as if he had already pulled the handle. In a stressful situation, the brain easily draws up details that correspond to the algorithm of actions. But he didn't pull it. This means that the fuel continued to flow into the ruptured pipeline at full pressure. Meanwhile, the Czech pilot, who was sitting a little to the right and a little higher, sees what the others do not see. His gaze through the side window falls directly on the left wing, on a huge tongue of fire bursting out from under the engine nacelle. A fire that is not just burning. It is already licking the wing skin, spreading further and further. The wing is on fire. He shouts, sharply, louder than usual, without any formality. These words become the point at which the crew's quiet work ends and the race against time begins. There was an immediate change in the cabin, not panic, no, but an awareness of the scale. This is no longer an engine failure. It's a wing fire, a fire that will grow every second. The captain doesn't hesitate for a moment. He gives the command, "Fire drill engine 2. Now, the co-pilot immediately gets in touch. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Speedbird 712. Engine fire. Returning to Heathrow. The dispatcher has already seen what is happening. A long, continuous flame could be seen from the tower. In a matter of seconds, an alarm is raised at the airfield, and fire brigades are set in motion. All planes located on the traverse of the final are given the command to leave for the second round. As the airliner turns back to Heathrow, the fire under the wing intensifies. Burning fuel is still escaping outside. The fire is lashing at the pylon, heating the structure, and every meter of the way back is a struggle for the plane to survive. And at that moment it becomes clear: every step, every second, every action of the crew, everything is now going close to the moment when the fire can do its own thing. The left wing was still ablaze, and a long plume of fire was trailing from the plane, like a disheveled distress flag that anyone who looked up at the sky at that moment could see. The flame was no longer just burning by itself. It penetrated inside the wing, warmed up the spar, reached the wiring to the hydraulic lines. All this hidden aircraft architecture, usually reliable, sealed, now became part of a huge, uncontrolled furnace. Metals literally began to get tired and lose their strength from the temperature. In the cockpit, the captain held the car with all his might. The failure of one engine on a 4-engine liner is not a disaster. But the failure of the engine, which continues to pour fuel on the wing, turning into an uncontrolled flare, is already a race for minutes. More precisely, for seconds. And the captain knew it. He looked back at the flight engineer's dashboard, where engine 2 readings were heading for 0. But even this 0 did not give him peace of mind. He saw out of the corner of his eye how the reflection of the fire danced on the instrument windows. He didn't need confirmation. Just a glance through the side window was enough to know that the fire was still strong. Hot air, smelling of kerosene, was already entering the cabin through the ventilation slots, leaving a barely perceptible smell of anxiety. The flight engineer continued to carry out the firefighting procedure, but the next detail of the checklist only repeatedly came up against the fact that the main step had not been taken. The fire handle was still untouched. This meant that the fuel line remained open. Somewhere in the back of the cabin, Barbara Harrison, unaware of the intricacies of what was happening in the cabin, continued to do her usual work, checking whether passengers were strapped in, preparing people for a possible return. She could hear the plane shaking slightly. I heard a hum that hadn't been there before, but I didn't know how serious it was yet. Meanwhile, the dispatcher informed the crew, "Any runway for your discretion. Fire services are on standby." This meant only one thing: choose any lane, sit down as best you can. Complete freedom of action. But this freedom was also disturbing. When the dispatchers give pilots any runway, there is a palpable silence of responsibility in the air. You understand that you are given the right to make a single decision, and that every second of delay may be the last. The plane was already at an altitude of about 3,000 feet when the fire on the wing began to change. Now it looked not just like a jet of flame, but like a flaming, molten lump wrapping around the base of the wing. The metal under the pylon glowed clearly, not by the reflection of the fire, but by its own heating. The captain understood. There was almost no time. If the fire gets to the spar, the one that holds the wing, the plane will simply lose its left console. And then everything will be over instantly. He decided not to return to the starting lane from which he took off. The 28L was far away. A large radius was needed to turn there, which meant more time in the air. More time means more chances that the wing won't hold up. He chooses the 05R lane, which is shorter without a landing system, but the closest one. Straight trajectory, minimum U-turns. We're landing on 05 right. The captain said, as if he were saying something mundane. Outside, the flames were now rising high, almost touching the underside of the wing. The fire began to penetrate the wing structures, where the flap controls were located. There were hydraulic lines inside, sensitive and vulnerable, and now they were gradually heating up. and only they were the key to the possibility of a soft and controlled landing. The captain cautiously gave the command to release the flaps. Little by little, step by step, the aircraft had to slow down, but it was impossible to load the damaged wing. The flaps began to open smoothly at first, then slowly, but they moved anyway. And suddenly they froze, at about 47 degrees. The flap indicator on the flight engineer's panel froze. Nothing was moving. Flaps stopped. He said softly, but in this silence there was a whole range of emotions. Understanding, anxiety, forced calmness. This meant that further mechanization would not work. The fire has already ruptured the hydraulic ducts or melted them, and the pressure has disappeared. 47 degrees. It wasn't enough for a short streak, but there was nothing left to improve the situation. The flaps came out somehow, and it's better than nothing. The captain knew that there was only one approach in such a situation. There will be no second attempt. Everything should work out now. The plane began a long, smooth left turn, almost 270 degrees to accurately get into a straight line at 05R. The car was being pulled to the left, and more force was being applied to the rudder pedal. The load was as if someone was constantly trying to turn the plane against their will. Inside the cabin, everything was already different. The passengers were silent. Someone was crying. Someone, on the contrary, sat as if petrified. Barbara walked down the aisle, comforted people, guided them, and helped those who had not yet realized the seriousness of what was happening fasten their seatbelts. But she could already see the flickering fire outside, reflected in the glare of the polished surfaces. The captain leveled the plane on the glide path. The speed was about 160 knots. For a few seconds, everything seemed to hang. A long silence, interrupted only by the sirens of distant fire trucks and the rustle of burning metal. The captain smoothly removed the thrust from the remaining engines, and the Boeing 707 began to decline. Smooth, careful, almost jewel-like. At a height of several meters, he slightly pulled the steering wheel. The liner touched the ground a little harder than usual, but exactly in the center. The wheels hummed, the friction intensified, and the plane ran along the runway with long, heavy steps, as if trying to keep its balance. The captain was on the brakes. The first officer activated the reversals of the extreme engines. The huge car began to slow down, and when she stopped completely, literally a second after that, something began inside that no one can be prepared for, because the fight in the air is over. But the struggle for life was just beginning. At the moment when the plane finally stopped, a strange, almost deafening silence hung in the cabin for a split second. It seemed as if the airliner itself had exhaled. After a brutal flight, after a struggle in the air, after a wild vibration and heat penetrating the wing structure. But this pause lasted only a moment. The next moment, everything was filled with sounds that meant that the fight was far from over. The captain unbuckled his seat belts and leaned over to the panel. He wanted to do what he was supposed to do according to the instructions. Pull the fire handles, shut off everything that could still fuel the fire. But there were already screams, the sound of falling things, the sounds of burning metal, and the pungent smell of heated kerosene seeping into the cabin. Perhaps he was distracted by someone's voice. There may be a sudden vibration of the case. Or perhaps he just saw how bright, thick flames were already creeping up to the rear of the fuselage, and realized that every second now had to be spent on evacuation. He pressed the button for communication with the salon and said clearly, loudly, "Evacuate, evacuate." These two words instantly transformed the salon into a lively, rapidly moving mass of people and emotions. In front, the stewardess, who was standing at the left door, immediately leaned forward and pulled the lock. The door swung open, revealing a bright, blinding flame. The ladder, which was supposed to be a rescue, turned outwards, opened, and at the same second began to melt. The heat was too intense. The material couldn't stand it. The fire from the wing and pylon licked the space right next to the doorway. The fabric of the ramp smoked, then burst into flames. The front left door became a death trap. Right side only. Stop it! The flight attendant shouted over the roar of the fire. Now everything depended on the right door. There, the ramp opened normally, and 2 crew members were already taking a position. One guided the passengers to the exit. The other supported the upper part of the ramp, stabilizing it. The sounds of the engines hadn't completely died down yet, and the wind created by the blades was tearing people's voices and screams away. But the passengers were already streaming in fast, albeit with the chaos that is inevitable at such moments. Outside, fire trucks that had arrived on alert were gliding along the strip. But each of them was an old model, heavy, slow, able to apply foam only on the spot. They had to stop completely to get into position. They tried to get closer, but the fire at the wing was so powerful that the foam beam simply did not reach it. The flames grew as if they were fueled not by liters, but by tons of fuel. And in the cabin, closer to the tail, everything changed much faster. The first part of the passengers, those who were sitting closer to the nose, were already running out onto the runway. Someone was rolling down the ramp. Someone was jumping, losing shoes, bags. Someone was falling, but they immediately picked him up and took him away. The whole process was chaotic, but it still had a rhythm to it. Desperate, fast-paced, but a rhythm. However, in the rear of the cabin, the situation was already much worse. After a powerful explosive bang outside, the heat went through the floor. The floor panels in the back kitchen area began to vibrate. Some fasteners burst, and smoke began to seep inside. The left anus was already illuminated with orange highlights. That was where the hearth was located. Barbara Harrison realized that the back 2 exits were her responsibility. The right rear door opened, but the ramp did not fully inflate. One of the male stewards who worked there made the decision instantly. He jumped himself. The height was decent, about 2 meters. He hit the concrete but got up. With an effort, he straightened the half-inflated ladder, trying to keep it in such a position so that people could somehow get down. Inside, at the left rear door, Barbara leaned forward. She tried to open the lock, and at the same moment pulled her hand away. The metal was so hot that it burned through the gloves. She realized that this way out wasn't just useless, it was deadly. To open it meant giving the flame a direct path. She let go of the handle and rushed to the right-hand door, the one that still had a chance. The smoke in the tail began to thicken. The light was dimming. People were coughing and disoriented. Barbara raised both hands, shouting loudly over the chaos. "This way! Keep moving! Leave everything! Move!" She began directing passengers to the right exit, literally pushing some away from delays. From the outside, the ramp could be seen shaking, its material weakening from the heat, but so far it was holding on. Several people came down it, some just jumped away. Some fell down into the arms of the steward who was standing below. Barbara held the top of the ramp, stabilizing it. But then, as the flow of people became smaller, she realized that those who had not yet moved remained at the tail. She turned around. The smoke was already low, almost at knee level. On the left side, the portholes were bright orange. The fire was literally pressing against the hull. She went back inside. Passengers later recalled that they saw her silhouette disappear in a puff of smoke, then reappear, bringing out people who practically could not see the way. She bent down to those who could not get up, took the children by the hands, lifted them up, turned them around to the exit. One man froze, paralyzed by fear. She literally pushed him towards the door. "Jump! It's only a short drop. Go!" The ramp was already beginning to sink. A liquid was gathering under it, molten material dripping down. But Barbara went back inside. Outside, eyewitnesses saw her appear in the doorway once more, looking around as if counting whether there was anyone left. Thick black smoke was billowing behind her, already hiding the rows of chairs, and she disappeared inside again. The last thing the survivors saw was her shadow disappearing into smoke before a strong heat front, like a sudden flash, covered the tail of the plane. The flame passed through the gallery corridor swiftly, consuming everything in its path. Several panels collapsed down, blocking the passage. Those whom Barbara tried to save, a woman in a wheelchair, a mother with a young daughter, 2 passengers who did not have time to unbuckle their seatbelts, died instantly. She died with them. Outside, you could still hear the voice of the firefighters. Screams, "Move back! Move away from the aircraft!" But it was already too late inside. And all this, from the moment the plane stopped to the moment the flames engulfed the tail, took less than 90 seconds. When firefighters were finally able to apply foam to the wing and tail, when the flames began to recede and thick clouds of black smoke rose above the strip, it became obvious how rapidly the tragedy was developing. The fireball was so powerful that the rear part of the fuselage literally dissolved, not figuratively, but physically. The metal had melted, the skin panels had disappeared, and the places where the passage had been seconds ago were now broken, curved edges of the structure. The front of the aircraft remained relatively intact, the cockpit, the business section, and the front rows. The ladder on the right front door was still hanging, tilted, but it had saved dozens of lives. The right rear exit was now just a dark rectangle against the backdrop of the mutilated rear section. It became impossible to get through there. The passengers who found themselves on the runway stood at a distance. Some were crying, others were in a state of stupor. There were abandoned items, shoes, and bags lying on the concrete floor, which had escaped from people's hands in a hurry. The sirens of ambulances and police cars could be heard in the distance, and an increasing number of services flocked to the scene. A few minutes after the fire got under control, some crew members who had received permission tried to approach the plane, but there was still enough energy coming from the heat to quickly drive them back. No one could get inside. It was too late. The next half hour was chaotic as the injured were helped to regroup. Those who jumped from the wing were supported by their arms, taken to the rocks, and the staff brought blankets and water. Outwardly, everything that was happening looked almost soundless. People were moving, but they didn't talk much. At such moments, even a person's language sometimes gives way to silence alone. One of the controllers later said that from the height of the tower, it all looked like a scene that could not be forgotten. The silver body of the plane, its front part still intact, and the charred rear, black, molten, broken. In the background, there are firefighters rearranging hoses, knocking down the last flames, and a group of people standing a little apart, the same ones who were in the salon a minute ago. By 1710, the fire was officially declared under control. But the investigation began long before the smoke had completely cleared. Already in the early hours, experts from the British Air Accident Investigation Department began to collect the first information. It was a stroke of luck that engine number 2 fell into a flooded gravel pit near Raysbury, which allowed it to be extracted relatively quickly and analyzed. When the experts opened the remains of the engine, there was no doubt. The compressor disc didn't just break down. It shattered into several large segments. It was they who pierced the casing, severed the fuel lines, and destroyed everything around them. In itself, this failure was not something unique. The engines of those years sometimes encountered internal damage. But the fact that the destruction turned out to be unrestrained, the fact that fragments pierced the hull, made the drama inevitable. However, no matter how difficult this technical detail was, the experts quickly came to another, much more important issue. Why wasn't the fire stopped? Why didn't the fuel cutoff happen? Why is the fire out of control? The investigation revealed a surprising and frightening combination of factors. All of them together created a chain in which each element reinforced the other. First, there is confusion between the engine failure and engine fire procedures. Both procedures were very similar, the steps were almost mirrored, the differences were subtle. Under conditions of high stress, the human brain tends to complete the course of action, following the most familiar path. The flight engineer thought he was doing everything right. He was sure that he was pulling the fire handle, although in fact his hand never completed the movement. Secondly, the location of the buttons on the panel. The fire alarm bell was turned off accidentally at the very second when everyone in the cabin was simultaneously reaching for the panel to turn off another sound signal. One wrong centimeter of the finger, and the main audio signal of the fire alarm was completely turned off. And finally, the pressure of the situation. In the first seconds after the explosion, the crew did everything possible. The captain brilliantly controlled the aircraft. The first officer accurately operated on the radio. The engineer worked according to procedures. But human memory under stress is unpredictable. It can create a false memory of an action performed, especially if a person expects in advance that he must perform it. The plane could have safely returned with 3 engines, without the slightest risk to passengers. Hundreds of engine failures in the history of aviation have ended successfully. But only one misstep, just one, opened the way for the fire. When the reports were completed, it became clear that the BOAC 712 tragedy was not the result of a single event. It was the result of a chain, technical, human, procedural. It all came together that day. But in parallel with this technical part, there was another layer, the human one. The actions of the crew, despite the error in the checklist, were considered highly professional. Landing on 3 engines with an active wing fire and with a huge structural asymmetry is a skill. This is an extremely complex control of a machine that was already beginning to collapse in flight. But most of all, the actions of the people in the cabin were noted. In particular, Barbara Jane Harrison. She has become a symbol of resilience and sacrifice. She stayed in the tail until the last one. She did not leave the cabin when the ramp began to collapse. She returned to the smoke, despite the suffocating environment, although she already knew that there was almost no chance of saving some people. Her last attempt to return for a woman in a wheelchair and a mother with a child was a moment of the greatest human courage. A year after the disaster, Barbara Harrison was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest award for a civic achievement. She became one of the youngest recipients of this award and the only woman in the world to receive it for her actions outside the combat zone. Her name is inscribed in the history of aviation as a symbol of the fact that sometimes an individual can do more than seems possible. And thanks to this tragedy, aviation has changed. Revised the checklists. The logic of the fire panels has changed. Airfield vehicles have become faster and more powerful. There are requirements for the ability to apply foam in motion. Inspections of the engine's internal components have become stricter, and metal fatigue analysis has become much deeper, and each subsequent flight became at least a little safer. However, the most important lessons remain simple. When the flight attendants say, "Leave your things," it's not a formality. When they say, "Move faster," it's not just words. When you watch a safety demonstration before takeoff, it's not a ritual, but a clue that can decide your fate. The story of the BOAC 712 is a reminder that even in the world's most technologically advanced industry, safety sometimes depends not only on metal, but also on people. From those who are sitting in the cockpit, from those who work in the salon, from those who listen to their commands, and from those rare people who, like Barbara Harrison, are ready to return to the fire when others come out of it. When the last flames went out, when the vehicles gradually pulled away from the charred fuselage, only traces remained on the strip. Dents from fire wheels, gray foam streaks, metal fragments scattered on concrete, and silence. The very silence that is impossible to hear on a typical airport day. The silence that remains after events that change destinies. For several hours, rescuers and investigators slowly, almost reverently approached what was left of the back of the plane. Stunned, tired people stood nearby. Passengers, pilots, technicians. Someone was crying in silence. Someone was sitting right on the concrete with his head in his hands. No one yet understood exactly what had happened, but everyone knew that something had happened that could not be forgotten. The investigation, which began almost the same evening, will soon reveal a chain of errors, technical and human. It will show a crack that was born long before this April day. It will show the details hidden inside the engines, and a single action that was never performed. But the investigation will show something else, not only why the fire started, but also why 122 people survived. Why did dozens of passengers end up on the runway alive, even though by all accounts everything could have turned out differently? The crew of Flight 712 did the impossible. The captain landed a jetliner with a burning wing, with thrust asymmetry, and with the threat of complete structural loss. The co-pilot kept in touch and followed procedures in circumstances that would unsettle even the most resilient. The flight engineer did his best in an environment where a few seconds difference turned a routine engine failure into a disaster. It was the work of 3 people who fought to the end, professionally with concentration, despite the collapsing chaos. But this story is remembered by the world for another reason. Of all the people on board, those who were in the cabin did the most. Dozens of people were able to get out due to the fact that the flight attendants acted quickly, accurately, without the slightest panic. They guided the passengers, led them to the exits, and extinguished the chaos with their calmness. And among them was one girl whose name today sounds as heavy as it is light, Barbara Jane Harrison. She stayed where no one else could stay, in that part of the plane where the temperature was rising every second, where the smoke was getting lower and lower, where the passages turned into a maze of incandescent structures. She could see that the right rear ramp was starting to sink, that the fire had come close to the hull, and that the chances were getting slimmer. But she didn't leave. She returned to the smoke over and over again. She pushed out those who froze in the doorway. She raised the children. I tried to persuade those who couldn't decide to jump. And at some point, when she no longer had a second or space to retreat, she turned around one last time and went back after those who were still in the tail. At the moment when the passage was already burning behind her, when the ramp almost touched the ground, when everything inside was filled with black darkness, pierced by flashes of fire, she was never seen again. Her feat became one of the clearest examples of the fact that a person is able to overcome fear, the instinct of self-preservation, and everything inherent in nature. Her name has become a symbol, not loud, not pretentious, but human, quiet, real. The kind of courage that doesn't require big words. The kind of courage that shows itself only in the most difficult moments. A year later, the state awarded her the St. George's Cross, the highest civilian award in the UK. She became one of the youngest women ever to receive this award, and the only one awarded it for her feats outside the war. But for those who survived because of her, there was and could not be a reward that would convey all that she had done. The tragedy of the BOAC 712 was a turning point. She changed aviation. The checklists have become clearer. Procedures are stricter. Fire trucks are faster and more powerful. Engine designs are stronger. Every lesson paid for that day was absorbed into the foundation of aviation safety. And today, when boarding a plane, we rarely think about how many disasters, mistakes, and human lives lie under our seats. In every instruction, in every button, in every movement of the crew. Aviation has not become safe by itself. People made her safe. Pilots, engineers, cabin crew, and those who once, without thinking about themselves, took a step forward when everyone else took a step back. The story of the BOAC 712 is not just a tale of tragedy. It is a reminder of the value of human life, that even in the darkest moments there is still a place for light, a place for courage, a place for a feat that will live in the memory of people who didn't know you personally, but who owe you their lives. And if you ever hear the name Barbara Jane Harrison, know that this name is not about death. This name is about the fact that a person is capable of being more than circumstances, about how even one person can save 100, about the fact that courage is not just a word. This is an action, and it's always given to someone very, very expensive.